Right, hello, and welcome to another Dauntless Development video. This is another C# tutorial, and today we're going to be looking at data structures with a specific focus on lists and arrays, as they're kind of the most commonly used. Now, first of all, what is a list? What is an array? So, both of them are data structures. So, data structure is just a structure for containing data. So they are, how best to describe it? It's just a collection. So a list is exactly what you would expect. It's kind of in order from starter to finish. So there is a beginning of the list, there is an end of the list. Now an array is also kind of ordered in that every single item has an ID. But where an array and a list differ is an array should, although you can change an array's size, it's difficult. Whereas a list is built to have it for the size to be changed, because if you think of it like a list in real life you are writing, you might add things onto the end of your list. Just the same thing happens in C#. Whenever you add something to a list, you add it to the end of the list. So when would you use an array and when would you use a list? Now, most of the time you're going to use a list. If you ever want to modify the size on the fly for a collection, you're going to want to use a list, because that very easily allows you to remove some things from the list and add other things. Whereas an array, you'd use that if you knew that you would always have a fixed size. But even then, you don't gain a lot of performance from it. You do gain some, definitely. But you don't gain enough often for it to be worth it. But sometimes you do. There are other benefits to arrays. So for example, this is how you'd create a list. So I'll say a list, and how you do it is you say list, then you use these angle brackets, and inside these angle brackets you have to declare a type. So what kind of information? So you use a variable type. So I'm going to say int, so it's just going to be a list of numbers, and I'm just going to call it numbers. Now if you follow through these tutorials, you'll have seen I've done a list of numbers before. So I'm going to call this numbers. Then you have to say equals new list of ints, and then you open these brackets. And that's because list is a class. And this is how you declare a class, as we covered previously. So that's how you would make a new list. And then if you wanted to add anything to the list, you could just say numbers.add, and it'll just add an item to the back. So you can just put a number in here, and it'll just add that to the end of the list. If you want to access a specific part of the list, you could say numbers.at. Sorry, is it just numbers? Yeah, okay, never mind. Numbers. So then you can say this, and you can put the ID. So if we wanted the first thing in the list, we could do that. If we wanted the second thing, we do that. Now, the reason we start off the first as 0 is because with computers, you start counting from 0. That's just how it works. So that's how you would be able to access it. If you wanted to remove something, you could. So you can say remove. So you could either reference the specific object. So if I put in 1, then it would look through the list for the number 1 and it would remove it. Or you can say, which is a little bit better, remove at, and then you can choose the ID. So if we want to remove the first thing in the list, we could remove the first. Now, you can also, I think you can do a lot of things. There's a lot of functions inside list, which is why I would generally say it's the best thing to do. Like if you look through all this, you can join two lists together. You can find out the max value in a list. You can order it. You can reverse the list. You can do all sorts of things. It's very useful. There's so many things you can do with a list that you just can't do with an array. But arrays aren't completely useless. One thing which is very good about arrays, which is less good about lists, is arrays are, you can have a single dimensional array, but it's very easy to have a multi-dimensional array. Now what I mean by multi-dimensional is you can have, so for example, the list has IDs that you can access. So you can access the index of the first one, which is at 0, index 1, index 2, and you can access each individual one. Now when you're creating an array, so I'm going to say int and then I'll call it, I'll just call it nums. It's the same thing. And it'll be equal to a new int. And then we can specify the size here. So this is where kind of it's beneficial having a list, an array, because you can say from the beginning, if you know how many items you're going to have, you can say, okay, clear me a block of memory in the computer that is the size of 10 ints, and that will be then reserved for here, and you don't have memory being kind of moved around a bit when it expands. It's not too big of a problem. This was more of an issue on like older hardware that wasn't as performant. These days you've got so much memory and such fast speed that it doesn't really matter. But it is worth noting that this is technically a lot more performant if you know the fixed size anyway. So this is how you declare that, and this would effectively work exactly the same as this if you only had 10 numbers in here. What you can do that's different though is, if we want, we could say int, and say you wanted a coordinate system, you wanted to store like a grid of coordinates. You could say int, and then you put a little comma in here, and we'll just say 2D. Oops, you can't. Yeah, okay. Coords 2D, and then I'll say equals new int, and then let's say we wanted a 10 by 10 grid, so we could say 10 and 10. So what we've done there is we can now access. So if you look at the first one, you've got nums, and then you could say 0, and you could access nums, the first one in that list. But in this one, we could say coords 2D, and then we could say you wanted to access the grid position 3, 3. You can do that really easily. Now this is given red underline because you want to do something, so I'd set it to like 10, let's say. And there you go, you can instantly access a specific thing. So if you're trying to make something like a grid, let's say you're doing some kind of like map generation, or I'm not sure, maybe you're doing something that requires you accessing an area, you can do that, and it's very easy. And it doesn't just stop at 2D, you could do 3D if you wanted. So let's say int, and then I'll just do 2 commas, and then we'll say coords 3D, and then equals new int. And then in here we could just, if we want a 10 in each direction, we could do the same thing again. So then you have 3D coordinates, which obviously could be useful if you are looking inside a space, some volume of space. Maybe you're working on a 3D game, and you want to store all the coordinates, or store information at each point. Like, this obviously doesn't have to be an int array. You could have it be a special class that you've made. So you've got a class called, in a 2D one, you might have a tile, or you might have the same in a 3D. And you could have information like maybe like movement speed modifiers, or is it walkable for like pathfinding and stuff. And you can kind of do all sorts with a multi-dimensional array. It doesn't have to be just restricted to game related things. But if you needed to store kind of like coordinates, this is a very good way of doing it, which is definitely better than using a list. However, having said that, one thing you can do is you could say have that tile class type, and it could just have a coordinate stored in it, like a 2D vector. And what you could do then is you could just store a list of those 2D vectors instead, and it would effectively be the same. So I would still say that out of these two, list is definitely the one to get used to and use the most. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, pardon the pun, of data structures. There are a lot more. So you can also use a dictionary. So a dictionary is similar to a list in that this is kind of how you declare it, except you use a key value pair. So what that means is you've got a key, which is kind of how you it's the type of information you might want to store. Like, you might want a key to something. Like, say we were talking about cars last time. So you might have a collection of cars, and the key might be the brand, for example. So you could then use the dictionary to access all the Fords. So in that case, you could have a string for the key, and then you could have the model as well. So we'll just say cars, and then equals new dictionary string. So that has so you could then use this to, like, say, access this, and you can say cars dot, and then I can't remember the exact of type, I believe. And you can search through the keys. Actually, you can access keys here. So key, contains key. There we go, found it. So you could loop through using like a while loop or a for loop or something like that, and you could then say contains key, and then you could just basically search for that items with that specific key. Now this is much less used, as I'm sure you understand by my explanation. I'm not particularly well versed with dictionaries, because you can basically do all the same stuff with a list, and it's a lot less complicated. There are some reasons you might want to use a dictionary, but as primarily a games programmer myself, I've not really found much use for it. But I can definitely see areas where you might, like, as I said, if you are using some kind of database, maybe storing like different types of items and stuff, that could be something that's very useful. But that was just a brief look at the fact that there is other data types, data structures. But yeah, so if I was to say one is better than the other, I would definitely say a list is better for almost all purposes. If you definitely always have a fixed size of like array. So for example, like I said, if you have like some kind of map grid, there's never going to be any additional tiles added or removed. In that case, an array will suit you just fine. It's a bit more optimized, and you can create it pretty easily, and access the information pretty easily, which I think is very nice. But for all other purposes, I would say your best bet is going with a list. So that's all for today. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.